Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society, and the Boston Public Library. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors NEHGS, and a producer of the series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of America's history, particularly in the 19th century, on the banks of the Potomac and Chesapeake rivers, on lands owned by the Catholic Church, and in the deep South, in faraway Louisiana. On your screen is a schedule for our hour-long event featuring the new book, The 272, The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the Catholic Church by Rachel W. Swarns. After some introductions, Ms. Swarns will join us for a conversation with tonight's moderator, historian Stephanie McCurry. They'll be in conversation for 45 minutes, answering during this time some of your advanced questions. Thank you so much for sharing those as you registered. We got a good number of them. If you have another very pressing question, do enter it into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll hope to get to one or two of those. Again, we'll be working mostly with advanced questions. Tonight's event will be recorded by my colleagues at the Brew Family Learning Center. Their video will be published on our website in the day ahead. All registered attendees will be emailed the link, which is also now being added to the chat. Of course, the real education comes from reading tonight's featured work, The 272, which you can take out from the Boston Public Library or from your local library, or you can own it for yourselves. Copies of the hardcover can be purchased from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. However you get a copy of this book, I recommend that you read the 272, as it offers an amazing window into a time past, recounting an important component of our country's history. It's no surprise that it was named a Best Book of the Year by The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post, Time, and several other publications. Now, for some background on tonight's author. Rachel L. Swarns is a journalism professor at New York University and a contributing writer for the New York Times, where she served as a reporter and correspondent for 22 years. At NYU, she focuses on American slavery and its contemporary legacies. In addition to her book, The 272, she is the author of American Tapestry, the story of Black, white, and multiracial ancestors of Michelle Obama. She is the co-author of Unseen, Unpublished Black History from the New York Times Photo Archive. Her work has been recognized and supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Ford Foundation, the Biographers International Organization, the Leon Levy Center for Biography, and the MacDowell Artist Residency Program, among many other organizations. In 2023, she was elected to the Society of American Historians. Now, for some background on our moderator and to start our evening, over to my counterpart at the BPL. Welcome, Kristen.
Thank you, Margaret, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Boston Public Library, as Margaret said, I'm Kristen Motti from the programs team, and we welcome you to tonight's program. Thank you all for joining us. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing our moderator for the evening. Professor Stephanie McCurry is the R. Gordon Hoxie Professor of American History in honor of Dwight D. Eisenhower at Columbia University. She teaches and writes about 19th century United States, the Civil War and Emancipation, and women's and gender history. Stephanie is the author of 3 prize-winning books: Masters of Small Worlds, Yeoman Households, Gender Relations and the Political Culture of the Antebellum South Carolina Lowcountry, Confederate Reckoning, Power and Politics in the Civil War South, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and Women's War, Fighting and Surviving the American Civil War. She is currently a fellow at the Dorothy and Lewis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, where she is working on a new book about the post-Civil War United States. Now let's please welcome tonight's featured author, Rachel L. Swarns, and moderator Stephanie McCurry. Welcome, and thank you for being here. Over to you both.
Hi, Rachel.
Hey, how are you?
So wonderful to be here with you again.
Pleasure as always.
And we have these amazing questions that came in from the audience. And I'm not embarrassed to say that preparing for tonight and reading the epilogue of your book today, I was just destroyed all over again. So let's start with the basics of this story for our audience. As I think I've mentioned to you before, I was really gripped by your story in the New York Times in 2016. It was on the front page. I didn't miss it. I think Columbia already had a Columbian slavery project, so the universities were starting to pay attention. And that was absolutely the most amazing, gripping story. And you've done a lot more on it since, and now in this incredible feat of research, really, your book, The 272. So I thought maybe this is a huge, sprawling 19th century and now 21st century story, which is quite amazing. And your book spans all of this. But it's not a story people know very much about, including, I think, the basics about the Catholic Church in the United States. And so I wondered if you would just begin by telling us how the history of 272 enslaved people in rural Maryland got entangled with the history of the Catholic Church in the early 19th century.
You're so right, because many people, maybe most Americans, don't know this history. I certainly didn't know this history. I happen to be Black and Catholic, and I had no idea. And I really stumbled across it accidentally. A colleague of mine at the New York Times got an email from a Georgetown alum who was pitching us on a story about this 1838 slave sale of 272 men, women, and children, organized by Catholic priests to save Georgetown, the first Catholic institution of higher learning. And she saw it and thought, oh, kind of interesting, but like, is this even a story, like a 19th century slave sale for the New York Times? And I always say that I'm so lucky that she didn't delete the email. She remembered I had written a book about Michelle Obama's enslaved ancestors and sent it along to me. And I knew immediately that it was a story, but I was also flabbergasted, like, Catholic priests enslaved people? Catholic priests bought and sold people? How didn't I know? And in a way, it's not a surprise. We often think about the Catholic Church as a northern church, as an immigrant church. Enslaved people have been largely left out of the origin story that's traditionally told about the church. And so historians like you know, but most people don't. And what I learned over time, though, was that slavery was, critical to the emergence of the church. And, I go back to the Jesuits who arrive in Maryland in the 1600s. Maryland, which was established in part as a refuge for Catholics who experienced discrimination in England. And when that colony transitioned from an economy that relied on indentured servants to one that relied on slave labor, the priests, who were large landowners, plantation owners, transitioned with it. And so, they end up, priests who enslaved people and bought and sold people ended up building the very foundations of the Catholic Church. They established the first archdiocese. Priests who relied on slave sales and ran plantations established the first Catholic institution of higher learning, built the first cathedral, established the first Catholic seminary. So it was really foundational to the Catholic Church and its emergence and expansion.
No, that's exactly right. And I think people don't maybe understand that where slavery was a source, enslavement, and the products of it, the staple products of it for the world market, were the source of wealth. The institutions of this young country grabbed onto that source of wealth, as we do to the sources of wealth in our own country, in our own time, and you use it to build the institutions. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about the slave sale itself in 1838, but I thought maybe you could say a little bit about how embattled the Catholic Church was as a faith in the United States in that period, and why Georgetown was, in other words, if as you said, they sold the people to save the college. What state was the college in? Could you set that stage a little bit for us too?
I think it is really interesting. I mentioned that Maryland was established in part as a refuge for Catholics because they were discriminated against in England. But, you know, there was a change in leadership. Protestants ended up running the colony, and even in the British colony, you know, of Maryland in the 1700s, there were, you know, rafts of anti-Catholic laws that really restricted people's lives in terms of voting and fully participating in life in the colony. And so, you know, and even on into the 19th century, you know, Catholics knew, obviously the priests were vested in slavery, but you know, abolitionists, even among abolitionists, there was an anti-Catholic strain to some of that too. So they were keenly aware of particularly in the 1700s, of the precarious position that they held. And obviously slavery helped support the priests and the institutions that they were building, but it also made them part of the establishment. It helped them to fit in. It helped them to be acceptable as kind of gentry, just like anyone else.
I think that's a really good point. You know, it's almost like what we would call a politics of respectability. You know, if you're a
That's absolutely
suspect
right.
people with suspect values and you're in a slave society, you know, and you say, okay,
And
we're
the
on board
highest
with this.
echelons
Yes.
of the society are these large slaveholders, right?
I think that's crucial. Could you tell us a little more about the what happened with this sale, where the people were, what particularly provoked it at that moment, how controversial it was, if at all, as a strategy, and who the people were who ended up getting snarled in this with such long-lasting consequences for them and their families?
Well, I think we have some interesting slides that we can share as I talk about this. We have a slide from slavery in the Chesapeake, which is kind of where the story begins. We also have a slide of Georgetown, early Georgetown, which we can share with you. And, you know, we're basically looking, this slave sale takes place in 1838. And it happens at a time when the economy is in bad shape nationally. Georgetown, again, the prize mission project is really struggling, in part because of the Jesuits' own mismanagement of of their own finances and the school. There's also something else, though. And, you know, they're relying on these plantations. We have a slide of St. Inigos where the family that I describe lived for a long time. The other thing that's important to talk about is that there was a vision of the future, and we have a slide of Thomas Milady that I think we can share. That's St. Inigos there. Here's Thomas Milady, who was an early president at Georgetown, an early influential leader of the Jesuits. And he had a vision. He looked around and said that this Catholic Church, rooted in this kind of rural plantation thing, is not the future. And he looked north and he could see the waves of immigrants pouring into the cities, Catholic immigrants. And he said the future of the Catholic Church is there. And we need to position ourselves to establish schools in these northern cities to serve these new families who were arriving. But how to do that? As I mentioned, the Jesuits and Georgetown were struggling, and the way forward, he thought the only way forward was to sell off their assets, and in this instance, human property, 272 men, women, and children, to save Georgetown, to stabilize the Jesuits, and then to look to the future, to build a network of schools that would serve these new families coming in from Europe.
I mean, I think that's a great point, because it's important, I think, to remember that the Chesapeake region right after the Revolution was not thriving. The
No.
crops that enslaved people had been growing, like tobacco,
yeah.
were just not they didn't corner the world market in it anymore, and it was just and also I think maybe people would be interested to know that universities were very different places than colleges. I mean, 14-year-old boys went to college, but they were usually the sons of merchants and planters. So but if the Catholic population's small, then Milady, not to justify his position, but just to underscore what you're saying, the Catholic population is coming into New York and Philadelphia and Boston, and Maryland, but not their future is not, he might be very right in saying that the future is Catholic education. Because and then so what happens here, and you write about this so powerfully, is that people in St. Inigo's and other properties that the Jesuits own, they're gathered up, divided, a few saved from the sale, but the majority of them snarled into this interstate slave trade. And they basically go, if you look at the statistics at that time, they enter a flood of enslaved people who are being sold from the Chesapeake area. Alexandria was one of the biggest depots for slave sales. Right. And I think this is where the 272 were
shipped off, in a ship by Catherine Jackson. That's right.
And then I was really shocked, but not surprised to read that they were moved to New Orleans on a slave ship belonging to Franklin and Armfield, which is only just to tell our readers that there was absolutely nothing unusual about these poor people being dragged into this stream. I think I've read that, I forget the statistic, like a quarter of all Black families were divided in the Chesapeake were divided. It's probably higher than that. I'm forgetting right now. But in any case, I thought maybe we would turn to the next part of the story, just about how you deal with this story, from there on in. And I have done some of this kind of research myself, and I know how hard it is to do. Archives of slavery are what I think of as fundamentally asymmetrical. If you want to know about the white people who own enslaved people, you could exhaust yourself in a lifetime and you wouldn't get anywhere near finishing the papers. But if you're looking for information on the enslaved, it's extremely hard to come by. And here you have managed to tell an incredibly human story by focusing on the division, the tearing apart of this community, and somehow learning enough about particular people to be able to let your reader identify with the human level of this horrific experience. So could you talk about how you handled that problem and of sources, and especially your decision and your ability to trace one particular family through this traumatic process to Louisiana and the remnant of it in Maryland?
When you're writing about enslaved people or doing this kind of research, you're keenly aware that there are some folks who think, oh, nope, not interested, nothing to do with me, long time ago, And so, I'm a journalist, and so I often think about audience and how to bring people into a story like this. And, I thought 272 people were sold, scores of families. I would focus on one. And the story that I tell is about the Mahoney family. And I start with the matriarch, a woman by the name of Anne Joyce, who arrives in Maryland in the 1600s as an indentured servant. And this slide is of the tall man standing there as one of her descendants. And she arrives as an indentured servant, thinking that she's going to have the kind of life that indentured servants did, that she would serve her contract, her term of years, and go on her way. But she arrives at a time, as I mentioned earlier, when the colony is transitioning from one that relied on indentured labor to one that relies on slave labor. Her contract is burned, she's forced into slavery, and she loses everything. Everything but her story. And she tells that story to everyone around her, the white people around her, her children and her grandchildren. And the story is simple. Our liberty was stolen and we should be free people. And her descendants tell that story and they resist. She has descendants who kill an overseer and are executed. She has descendants who take the Jesuits to court, sue the Jesuits to try to win their freedom. But only a few are successful that way. She has a descendant by the name of Harry Mahoney, who saves the church's wealth during the War of 1812 and garners a promise from the Jesuits that as a reward for his courage and his loyalty, that neither he nor his family would ever be sold. And that promise is broken in 1838 when the family, many of his children, are sold. And you talk about the challenges of doing this kind of work. Many of you listening may or may not know that enslaved people by law and by practice are mostly barred from learning to read or write. So, you know, letters, the kinds of materials that historians often rely on during this period are really scarce. I think there's only one letter that has been uncovered that was written by an enslaved person connected to this during this time. So, you know, I said scores of family were enslaved. How did I settle on this one? It was because of the records that were available. There are so many families that have compelling stories. The lawsuits that I mentioned were so important. They still exist. And, you know, there were people with depositions who talked about Anne Joyce and her arrival, who had heard stories about her. There were some of her descendants were quoted. So I was able to, you know, kind of track the arc of this family's experience, and it paralleled kind of the emergence of the church and, you know, its expansion. And then you're relying too on, you know, records from the enslavers, the plantation records, inventories, but also this oral history that stayed within this family well into the 20th century. There were priests who knew them too in the early 20th century because some of the members of the family remained in Maryland, and their writings exist too. So you're kind of piecing together, kind of stitching these fragments together. And there are many, many holes and gaps, you know, things that I will never know.
I think one of the most moving parts of this story for me is when these parts get reconnected. And you have a picture, two photographs in your book of one descendant from the Mahoney family on the Maryland side and one from the Louisiana side. But this is like, I don't know, 2017 or 2018, or it's just absolutely amazing what you were able to do. So this is one of the questions, you know, I think that readers, our audience would be really interested in is the Louisiana descendants, you know, and how far you were able to get. I mean, I don't think, probably because I'm a historian and not a journalist, even when I read your story in the New York Times back in the day, I didn't think to myself, oh, how many descendants are there now? But you kind of have an estimate, right?
That's right. So when I wrote that first story, you know, the Georgetown alum who I mentioned, Richard Cellini, he established a research nonprofit, the Georgetown Memory Project, and his team of genealogists had identified a handful of people. And now there are more than 6,000 living descendants. And we have pictures of two of them, Jeremy Alexander and Melissa Kemp. And I think we'll share some of them. That's President Jack DeGioia of Georgetown, who will talk a little bit about kind of his efforts. And these are some of the Catholics who remain in Maryland. But we have these two photos of Jeremy and Melissa, and I think maybe they appear after the photo of, yep, there we go. There's Jeremy. And I mentioned that, you know, that family of Harry Mahoney, that promise that he garnered, that his his family would never be sold. I talk about two of his daughters, Anna and Louisa, who were torn apart in the sale. Jeremy is a descendant of Anna, who ended up in Louisiana. And the next photo is Melissa, who is a descendant of Louisa, the sister who ended up in Maryland. And it's a great story, actually. Melissa, after reading the story and learning more about her history, she actually knew a lot because that oral history in the Maryland line remained. But one of her family members did a DNA test. They matched, she and Jeremy matched. As you know, if anyone out there has done a DNA test, they kind of let you know if you have kind of DNA connections. And she calls him up and says, hey, I think we're related because of these two sisters. And maybe you've heard about that Georgetown sale in 1838. And he was dumbfounded. He said, do you know where I am right now? I am at Georgetown. He happens randomly, crazily to be an employee of Georgetown, and learn that history, that way.
Yeah, that's just an unbelievable story. And the reunion, you said at one point there, you wrote towards the end of the book that there was a family reunion of something like 600 members of these two strands of this family. And also the oral history that you said Louisa passed down to her, like through her line, just a fragment can be enough. So that I remember you saying, and Melissa said that she had always heard something about Algiers, and then she realized that it might be a neighborhood in New Orleans. And
that's right. They thought Algiers, maybe Algeria,
exactly,
what Algiers,
like,
right?
But then
yeah,
it's like a jigsaw puzzle.
It's so interesting.
Go back together again. Well, we're getting very close to the time when we want to be letting our audience ask the question. So I just want to ask you to, talk about one more thing that I think is super important in the story you tell and the way you crafted this book, which is, I think, following very much from the two descendants that you just spoke about Cellini's Memory Project, the Georgetown and Slavery Project, which Adam Rothman has done so much to nurture, and the students. But that what has happened, up to the present. So, we talk all the time, I think, not enough, but more than we used to, about the afterlives of slavery, about just the living consequences of it into our present. And I think this is one of the most powerful parts of the story the book you've given us, is that it connects directly to the current moment. But it also offers a kind of an interesting but sort of complicated representation of the reparations discussion. Jeremy and Melissa talk about what their families had lost and what is owed to them. And sometimes Jeremy talks about the restoring just dignity. I mean, there's an open conversation about what the now identified descendants want Georgetown to do, or the Jesuits to do, or the Catholic Church to do. And would you just bring us up to speed on how far that conversation and process has gone? And also, how the descendants have made themselves an important voice in that.
Right. People often ask me, so, when these descendants learn about this history, my goodness, what is that like? And I often say, well, they wept, they raged, and they organized, and they really came together in growing numbers to press Georgetown and to press the Catholic Church to address this history. Georgetown, even before my story ran, had already created a working group to wrestle with this history, to kind of think about it, and to figure out ways forward. And what Georgetown has done is a number of things. They've apologized for their participation in the slave trade and in the enslavement of people, as have the Jesuits. They've changed the names of some buildings. They've created an institute to study slavery. They've got an archive making these records available to descendants, to the public. They've also established what they call a reconciliation fund. They've committed to raising $400,000 a year to benefit projects that will support descendants. And those grants have started going out. The Jesuits, for their part, partnered with a group of descendants to establish a foundation. They have pledged and promised to raise $100 million to support, again, projects that will benefit descendants and racial reconciliation projects. It's the largest effort by the Roman Catholic Church to try to address this history. I should say that, you know, descendants, if you've got thousands of people, you've got thousands of opinions. So, you know, it's messy. You know, I think many people are feel like it's important that the institutions have taken steps. Many people feel like it's just not enough. And so these kinds of conversations are ongoing. And I think also too, important work, which is perhaps less tangible, you know, than these funds that Georgetown and the Jesuits are working with, is what what you talked about. Is just the descendants working to stitch back together these families that were torn apart, and that has been really powerful to see.
Yeah, I was really, really struck by that at the end of the book. The simplicity sometimes of what the repair is, that I can call people by their name, that I can make a genealogical chart, you know,
Yes.
things that some people have the luxury of taking for granted, that you know where your name came from. I mean, these are, as you know better than me, this is how that history, this is how enslaved people passed their history down. You were named for your grandmother.
That's right. And often you saw that. Yes.
Yeah,
Oh,
no,
right.
that's often the key,
That's
the
right.
key
That's
thing.
right.
One thing I do want to ask you that I don't think I've ever asked you before, I'm curious about, is when I'm sure many people in our audience are wondering about the Catholic Church itself. I mean, we don't want to go backwards in the story, but the Catholic, there was some division even among the Jesuits around this, and you have your hero, the guy who tried. You know, he was the least
right.
low man on the totem pole as usual,
That's
but he
right.
tried. He wasn't the boss, so that didn't work out, but he did what he could, which is at least something in this horrible history. But I never asked you this before, but has the Vatican taken a formal, I mean, part of the reason that so many people in the United States feared Catholics was that they were afraid the Vatican was going to call the shots and tell them how to vote and what to do. It is this big uber organization, I say as a Catholic, with a hierarchy and a headquarters. I know the Jesuits have made this, they've acknowledged the sin.
That's
And
right.
the injury.
That's
But
right.
what about the Vatican? Because, you know, a few people actually wrote this in the pre-submitted questions, is they wanted to know how common this was beyond the Chesapeake, that the Catholic Church in various parts of North America or the world were involved in propagating
Yes.
slavery.
Which is a very good question to ask. Both of those questions. You know, there were more people enslaved by priests in Latin America, far more than here. You know, Rome, the Jesuits' leadership in Rome has publicly addressed this. The descendants reached out when they felt like Georgetown and the Jesuits weren't moving quickly enough. And the leader of the Jesuits from Rome wrote back saying, no, this is a sin. This is a sin and it has to be addressed, and our provincials here will work with you to address it. I know they've also reached out to Pope Francis, but at least there has not been a response, a public response that I'm aware of.
Yeah, well, that's a huge thing, and the Catholic Church is being, you know, they're being pressed to address all kinds of historic.
There's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on. And one thing, you know, this used to be an old debate within the sort of historians of slavery, was about the differences between slavery in Catholic countries and slavery in Anglo-American countries. And it's not inconsequential, because marriage is a sacrament. And in the Catholic countries, they are not going to, the Jesuits must have been in a very tough position around that. They probably tried to
And they
honor.
talked about it. Yes, they talked about it. One of the concerns that they had, and again, they are interesting and complicated because they, unlike some white people, didn't view, the enslaved as brutes or as animals. They believed that they were human beings with souls and souls that needed to be tended. When we talk about records, some of the most important records are sacramental records because, marriages, deaths, baptisms are important records. And they, one of the reasons why they settled on Louisiana as a place for folks to go was because there were very large plantations there. And they thought, okay, we can get just a handful of buyers who would keep families together. Unfortunately, that was what was supposed to happen. In practice, that didn't always happen, and families were separated. But they were absolutely thinking about that, and I mean, very specifically thinking about that.
I think that what you're saying here is really important because they were removed at least to a Catholic community, and as you are supposed to be, and as you said in the book, many people retained their loyalty to the and devotion to the Catholic Church, which is, and as you said, some whole lots of Black people left the church and went into separatist Black churches the first chance they could, God bless them.
Right.
But you're talking about surprising numbers of people who stayed
Families
devoted. Black nuns from this family.
Right, lay leaders,
leaders.
They established parishes,
Knights of Columbus, the whole
thing.
And one of the things that I would really like to underscore, just as sort of like historians' little inside baseball thing, is we love French colonies because they have way better records. They have notarial records, they have baptismal records. There's no records of marriages in Protestant churches in the United States. There's no record of baptisms.
Right.
So you were a little bit lucky.
I was very right. As hard as it is, the Jesuits, even in Maryland, even in English speaking, there is a trove of records, and I often, now they weren't often writing explicitly, like the enslaved people weren't front and center all the time, right? It's a name here or there, but they wrote about them and the records, and they kept those records.
Yeah, and the French tradition was much more notarial, like things just really had to be written down. One of the questions that a member of the audience sent in early, I think, is really crucial here. And they ask, how did the Catholic priests justify slavery and the selling of slaves? And I think that's another great 19th century question. We talked about the institutional thing, why they would have embraced slavery as a sort of socioeconomic proposition, but how did they justify it?
Right. And like I said, it is this kind of, for us here in the 21st century, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. But like I said, they believed that enslaved people were human beings who had souls. And not only did they have souls, but they had souls that needed to be tended, and that they, as Catholic priests, had an obligation to tend to those souls at the same time that they felt comfortable buying and selling their bodies. And like, how do you square that circle? Part of it is that, of course, slavery was legal, but also too that, the church, Rome, denounced the enslavement of the indigenous, right? But the enslavement of Black people, I mean, the Rome took a long time to make such statements, really long. And so there was no spiritual, bar either. Now, having said that, though, it is so important to know that all along the way, there were priests who raised questions and raised concerns and even objected to this mass sale. And, I mentioned, and you did too, Father Joseph Carberry, who somehow, when he looked at the enslaved, saw very differently, viewed them very differently. He saw more than assets. He saw capacity, he saw faith. He, arranged an experiment on his plantation where he said, the Jesuits are always complaining that they're not working hard enough. Why would they work? Maybe we should pay them. Maybe they should get some in the profits. When he established what was kind of an early kind of sharecropping system where, you have your acres, you tend it as you will, we'll share in some of the proceeds. And, a senior priest from Ireland came and marveled at the difference. And, and when the slave traders came, he really encouraged members of the Mahoney family to run in 1838. So these were lonely voices for sure. As you pointed out, Carberry was low on the totem pole. He couldn't change much, but it's important to know because I think sometimes people often say if you're writing about or researching slavery, don't bring your 21st century morality to this question. Yeah. But in real time, these priests were wrestling with these questions of ethics and morality.
100%. And I think that this argument about, well, this on spiritual balance, this is a net gain because we've saved these people, that, half of the defenses of slavery in the United States were written by ministers, not priests, ministers. It's horrifying. So
right. And I think that's important to say too, actually, because, people sometimes would say to me, oh, Rachel Swarns, you're still a practicing Catholic. How can you do that? I'm kind of like, where would I go? I mean, because it's not just the Catholic Church, right? Baptists, Protestants, the Quakers enslaved people before they didn't. So this was really, this was foundational to so many of our religious institutions.
Absolutely. And, Quakers by this point were the leaders on this anti-slavery faith.
That's right.
But as you said, they converted earlier.
They converted much earlier.
Anti-slavery, but they also, that was a brutal battle for them too. Some of the questions we have are a little lighter. Let's take a lighter one. Somebody just wants to know, as I would have asked you myself if they hadn't, what was your favorite discovery or accomplishment of this project?
I think it's a thing that you mentioned, just that so many of these people remained Catholic. I mean, it was really just so surprising to me when they had a choice and could leave that they stayed. And not only did they stay, but many of these families became, as we talked about, lay leaders. We even have, some sisters, mother superior in a religious, in a convent. And they really worked to make the church more responsive to and reflective of Black people, of the parishioners. And I, as a Catholic myself, that felt really inspiring. And I like to think that, it's on the one hand, it's hard to imagine kind of, these folks who were betrayed and sold, their families torn apart by this church. How could they stay? But I like to think that they thought that this faith did not belong to those sinful white men, that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit belonged to them too. So that was really, I think, one of the most, as a Catholic writer doing this work, important things for me.
I really love how you just put that. I mean, I think that's right. There's a sort of sense of ownership.
Yes.
And of claiming,
yes.
And also just I think what I love about that is just the deep down sense that you might have said this for 3 centuries, that we weren't worthy, but we always knew that we brought more to this faith than you gave to, it's our faith. And I think we see this about democracy in the United States. We see this about liberty.
Very much.
It's
very much.
Where would we be without that faith?
Right. That's
of
right.
various sorts.
That's right. And also too, it was, I still remember when I realized, wow, so the church relied on slavery to build these institutions, but these families were building too, that they had mission, one of the Mother Superiors had built a mission project out in Central America. They built Black parishes. They established, as you said, fraternal organizations and schools. They were Catholic institution builders too.
It's amazing. Now, somebody asked a very practical question on here, which I want to be sure to ask you. They said, how would one find out if their ancestors were among the 272?
Great question. That first story that I wrote was accompanied by a sidebar, a story where we asked people, are you connected to this history? Because we knew that there were more than that handful that Richard Cellini's group had found. And, one of the mentioned that these folks traveled on a ship, the Catherine Jackson, from Alexandria to New Orleans, and the passenger manifest, the passenger list of that ship is an important record because it carries the first and last names of dozens of the people. And so we published that list, and you can see that list yourself. We mentioned the Georgetown Slavery Archive. If you Google Georgetown Slavery Archive, you will see it. It has the names of these families, and it also has many of these records that were very helpful to me, now digitized and available. You can also reach out to Richard Cellini's Georgetown Memory Project if you think you have a connection. Many of these families were enslaved on plantations in Southern Maryland, and many of these families ended up in places like Ascension Parish, in Iberville Parish, in Louisiana. So those are places where you can check out Georgetown Memory Project and the Georgetown Slavery Archive without even leaving your desk.
Amazing. That one thing you just said, I'm so jealous. So I know ship lists are great, but they've had last names. I mean, when I'm searching for enslaved people and enslaved families, oftentimes the last name doesn't appear until after emancipation.
That's exactly right. It's such a great document, because often I'm just thinking about the records that for the most part, in the Jesuit records, for instance, their names, it's just first names also. So it really was a really important
So
document.
would there have been people with the surname Mahoney on that ship then? Did you see?
So let me think about this. So because of the marriage, so for instance, I mentioned the two sisters.
Maternal side.
Yes, but there were some of the siblings, male siblings of the sisters who were sold. So there are some Mahoneys.
That's fascinating. I wonder how, I just don't think that's very common.
Well, it's interesting. Oh, you mean that record? Yeah.
Well, no,
Yeah.
not just the record, but that the record would have last names.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Maybe people who've looked at slave ship lists would be, I've never seen them, so I
Yeah.
shouldn't talk beyond what I know. We have a few more minutes, and I thought that maybe what was I about to ask you about this? Let's see. Oh, okay. This is a question one of the audience members asked, and take it as best you can. It's a doozy.
Okay, I'm ready.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Basically, the other reality of now. It's like you're writing this history. I'm writing a version of it that's about the 1860s to the 1890s. And that's one thing, you publish your book, your work was much more public facing than most academics for sure. But here we are in a moment. So you're making this history known, you're making it available, and yet we're in a moment where we're being told not to teach it.
That's right.
And so this person asks, the really tough question was, how can history like this be like what you reveal in this book be part of a, say, K-12 curriculum without being polarizing or drawing fire? Or, I mean, I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
It's such a good question, because we are really in a moment where history is a battleground. And, you have these I always like to think about these two trains running, right? You have, on the one hand, these fledgling efforts popping up all across the country. New York, the governor just announced that we're going to be looking at reparations, possibly a commission on reparations for slavery in New York, the state of California. You have many institutions, many universities, Harvard's looking at this now, many religious or Episcopal churches, Episcopal seminary, many groups, right? Getting into this work at the same time that you have, these efforts by politicians, by individuals to kind of say, no, this shouldn't be taught. These books shouldn't be in libraries or in schools. I remember I had a fellowship when I was just getting started on this work, and one of the best questions that came to us, a group of interdisciplinary folks working on kind of racial justice issues. If money and time were no object, to promote the goals of your project, what would you do? And I thought to myself, I'd write middle school textbooks. That's what I would do. Because I think that it's so important for there to be this understanding of the connection and that of slavery and contemporary institutions, that it's not this long ago thing, nothing to do with me. It's all around us now. But the questioner is right that this is harder and harder to do in a lot of places.
I mean, it's that issue even in university curriculums now, never mind K-12. So it's a really tough moment. And I agree with you about this. I mean, I remember in 2016, at the end of the Obama administration, when Ta-Nehisi Coates was writing prominent articles about reparations and various, there was a really, really active debate. And I thought, God, this is a really different moment. I felt it was really tough, because there was all the so pro-Confederate stuff going on at the same time. I mean, you never get one without the other, but I still felt so encouraged. Like, finally, people are, ordinary people are being asked to think about the implications of this for our own children, the way we organize our own lives. And then it just got so, it's going,
Yes.
it's become so threatening, I think, is what's happening.
Yes.
But I and I agree with you about middle schools. Like, there are, and bless the teachers, because I have been involved over the years in projects that are funded by foundations, usually, that teach teachers. And they, the idea is they bring people like us in for a week, and on slavery or the Civil War or whatever. And you don't teach teachers how to do what they do. You just let them be scholars for a week, and they learn new things, and then they decide what is the appropriate way to give this more complex or nuanced story, or just more detailed human story. I remember when my kids were little, I think my son thought that Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln were Black. Like, they just get so confused, there's just like a couple of freedom fighters here, and they're basically the same. And and every enslaved person, or every story about slavery they wrote, the person was already free. They were running to be free. And you think, how do you break it to them? That
Right.
and
So complicated.
it's not an easy story to tell. Well, I'm going to indulge myself with one question at the end, unless people, I'll maybe pull a few off the chats, but I know you're out there telling us all about this book, but do you have something else you're interested in working on now?
So, one of the things that I'm working on now is, I have this idea of really wanting people to understand these connections between slavery and contemporary institutions. And so I'm working on building a digital archive where I kind of view it as kind of one-stop shopping. I'm envisioning some mapping components so that if you are in Chicago, that you could click on Chicago and look and see in your community which institutions have their roots in this history, and be able to connect and click and see the primary source documents that show that relationship. And I think if people can see this on a local level in their own communities, I think it will be much more meaningful, much more real to them. And so that's what I'm working on right now.
Sounds amazing. And I can just imagine what any one of those maps would look like, because I think we still haven't really gotten just spatially, we haven't gotten our minds around. We talk about one institution at a time.
That's right.
The university, the church,
That's
the
right.
banks,
The
the
banks.
railroads,
That's
the
right.
insurance companies, the hospitals,
That's right.
the medical profession. We talk about them one at a time. But
Yes.
this is all going on at once. And something interesting is, that sounds exactly like something you would do, by the way, and amazingly. That the New York Times, if you were still at the New York Times, it sounds like an amazing project for them, like the 1619 project. The other thing that's coming up, and I realize this is a Boston evening sponsored, but the anniversary of emancipation in New York is coming up.
Yeah,
And that's
right.
going to be really interesting because, you know, as people in Boston, I'm sure are aware that we've had this process in recent years of undoing the version that said, well, we don't have anything to do with that history in the North. That history is only in the South. What, New York? No. Boston? No. And
Right.
I remember many years,
New Jersey,
New
which had
Jersey,
slavery so late to the
50 something,
1860s. I mean,
1850 something, yeah.
yeah.
And I remember when New York did the New York Historical Society did a New York and slavery project exhibit, and I was walking around this and I would hear people saying, literally saying, I had no idea.
That's right.
And, you know, it was mostly in the period of the revolution, but nonetheless, I mean, 10% of, I think, people in New York City at one point were enslaved, or probably more than that. Anyway, I think we're coming up on the end of our time. So is there anything you'd like to say at the end, Rachel, to wrap it up?
You know, I'm just so glad that all of you have come. I think what's really important to me as a journalist who does this work is that we need to it's hard history, right? It's difficult history. But it's our history, all of us, you know, and we need to kind of grapple with it. And one of the things that I say about this book and about this family is that, yes, it's a story of heartbreak for sure, but it's also a story of resilience and family and faith. And that's, you know, those kinds of stories about families kind of enduring this period are really important. So I'd say let's grapple with this together, and you know, and the families and their stories, I think, are really inspiring.
Well, we're very lucky we have you leading us through this. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you both so much. Painting a portrait of this time in America's history, it is really important that we get the full picture. And this, your point about Black resilience and the story there is so important too, that we really understand it fully today. All of us are grateful for the work you've done educating us. And I loved Wept, Raged, and Organized. There is goosebumps there, and a lot that we all can do. As we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration series, we've asked Rachel to do a final reading from her book. So Rachel, back to you for that.
I'm gonna read a little bit about Jeremy, one of the descendants of the two sisters who were torn apart. And in this section of the book, I asked him to think about, you know, all these different initiatives, efforts. You know, descendants are really divided about kind of what they think about what Georgetown is doing and what the Jesuits are doing. And he says, we still have to wait and see. But as he walks to work through Georgetown's leafy campus, Jeremy remains keenly aware of how much has changed. He feels the presence of his ancestors now, he said, and he feels confident that Louisa, Anna, and the others are guiding the descendants as they work to repair what was broken and reunite the families that the Jesuits tore apart. It has been a spiritual journey, he said. The ancestors want us back together.
Thank you so much. Those of us who live in the world of family history truly appreciate your words. And we agree with Jeremy, the feeling that comes from knowing that your family is present, that knowing your place and knowing your impact on history. These are powerful, really, truly healing forces. So thank you so much for these important stories. A reminder to our audience, copies of the 272 are available from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or you can check it out from your library, the Boston Public Library, or your own library. I suggest, and Kristen too, we suggest heartily for your continuing education and your growing awareness to get a hold of the book. Before we close, Kristen, over to you to tell us a little bit about the Boston Public Library and what's upcoming.
Margaret, and thank you, Rachel Swarns and Stephanie McCurry, for that insightful conversation. And thank you all for joining us tonight in the audience. Before we close, just a word about the Boston Public Library and what you can find in our collections. You can find out about upcoming programs, resources, and services for people of all ages, free to all, at bpl.org. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Margaret, back over to you.
Thank you, Kristen. We at American Ancestors NEHGS are delighted to have co-presented tonight's book talk. If you're researching a time, a person, a family, my colleagues are here to help. Free to the public, you can chat with one of our genealogists, and our Brew Family Learning Center hosts many educational programs providing skills for family historians. You'll see on screen that we provide intelligence and direction on accessing all sorts of records that make up America's diverse history. Our mission in all we do is to educate, inspire, and connect people. And for you literary sorts, first, for tonight's discussion, I want to give special thanks to American Inspiration Series sponsors Susan Kay and John D. Thompson. Book lovers and readers they are, and for those of you like them, please join us for more author talks. Looking ahead, on February 6th, we'll welcome the remarkable journalist Lisa Belkin, who Rachel Swarns knows from New York Times days. She's coming with her chilling, kaleidoscopic new book, Genealogy of a Murder: 4 Generations, 3 Families, 1 Fateful Night. She'll be doing a presentation about a true crime that affected her family and the stories she heard and how she pursued that history affecting 3 other immigrant families in the United States. Then she'll be in dialogue with our senior genealogist, Melanie McComb, who actually did some research for her on her family history. It'll be a really interesting and educational event. On February 26th, we'll host Ilian Wu and her new book, heralded by the New York Times as one of the top 10 of last year, Master, Slave, Husband, Wife: An Epic Journey from Slavery to Freedom. This is the remarkable story of Ellen and William Craft, who escaped slavery through daring, determination, and disguise. Our guest author will be joined in discussion by a descendant of the Crafts. So that's going to be a really interesting event, them talking about that history. And on March 7, we'll hear from journalist and professor Brooke Kroger about her book, Undaunted: How Women Changed American Journalism. In an illustrated presentation, she will take us from the time of Margaret Fuller to the investigative triumphs of Ida B. Wells to the influence of Joan Didion and Cokie Roberts. All this history before joining in conversation with Tracy Lucht, president of the American Journalism Historians Association. Back to tonight, Kristen and I want to thank especially our guest author, Rachel Swarns, and moderator, Stephanie McCurry. What a brilliant conversation. And to the audience out there in Zoom land, we truly thank you for being here. There's hundreds and hundreds of you on with us tonight. We appreciate your interest in America's history in all of its diversity, the good stories and the less good stories, and your love of the truth in history. We hope to see you soon again. For now, a good night to all, and thank you to the brilliant ladies on screen with me. We are very grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.